David Martinez adjusted the strap of his camera bag as he walked through the entrance of the Marine Corps base in Camp Pendleton. The security guard checked his press credentials twice, eyeing the professional camera equipment with the careful attention that military personnel were trained to give. David had photographed dozens of military events over the past 5 years, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the crisp October morning air, or perhaps the way the Marines he passed seemed more formal than usual. The retirement ceremony for Colonel James Harrison was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and David wanted to scout the location first. His editor at the local newspaper had assigned him this job with specific instructions: capture the dignity and honor of a decorated Marine's final day of service. It seemed like a straightforward assignment, the kind David could handle in his sleep. As he made his way across the parade ground, David couldn't help but notice the meticulous preparation taking place around him. Young Marines were setting up chairs in perfect rows, their movements precise and coordinated. Others were adjusting flags that hung motionless in the still morning air. Everything had to be perfect for Colonel Harrison, who had served his country for 32 years. David found the building where the ceremony would take place and pushed open the heavy doors. The hall was larger than he had expected, with high ceilings and walls lined with military portraits and commendations. Natural light streamed through tall windows, creating the kind of dramatic lighting that photographers dream about. He pulled out his camera and took a few test shots, adjusting his settings for the indoor conditions. A young Marine approached him, her uniform immaculate and her bearing confident. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the photographer from the Tribune?" "That's right," David replied, extending his hand. "David Martinez. I'll be covering the ceremony today." "Corporal Jennifer Walsh," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I've been assigned to assist you today. Colonel Harrison requested that we make sure you have everything you need." David was surprised by the level of attention. Usually, military events were more restrictive about media access. "That's very kind of him. I was hoping to get some shots of the setup, maybe some candid moments before the ceremony begins." Corporal Walsh nodded. The colonel specifically mentioned that he wanted this day documented properly. He said it was important that people understand what it means when someone dedicates their life to serving others. As they talked, more people began arriving. David watched through his viewfinder as family members found their seats, their faces reflecting pride mixed with the bittersweetness of endings. He captured a moment between an elderly woman and a middle-aged man who was clearly Colonel Harrison's son, their resemblance unmistakable. The woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while her son squeezed her shoulder gently. David moved quietly around the hall, his camera clicking softly as he documented the gathering. He had learned long ago that the best photographs often came from these quiet moments before the formal events began. A group of Marines stood near the back of the hall, their conversation animated as they shared stories. David could see the genuine affection in their faces as they spoke about their commanding officer. "Those are some of the colonel's men from his last deployment," Corporal Walsh explained quietly. "They flew in from all over the country to be here today." David raised his camera and captured the group, focusing on a young sergeant whose expression seemed to hold a mixture of respect and sadness. These were the shots that would tell the real story, the human connections that made military service more than just duty and honor. As the hall continued to fill, David noticed an older man in civilian clothes being escorted to a seat in the front row. The man moved slowly using a walking cane, but his posture was unmistakably military. Several Marines stopped to shake his hand as he passed, their faces showing deep respect. "Who's that?" David asked Corporal Walsh. "General Morrison, retired. He was Colonel Harrison's first commanding officer when he was a lieutenant. The colonel credits him with shaping his entire career." David smiled to himself. This was exactly the kind of detail that would make his coverage special. He positioned himself to capture the moment when Colonel Harrison would inevitably greet his old mentor. The hall was nearly full now, and David could feel the energy changing. Conversations became more subdued, and people began settling into their seats. He checked his equipment one final time, making sure his backup camera was ready and his memory cards had plenty of space. Today was about honoring a man's 3 decades of service, and David wanted to make sure he captured every important moment. Corporal Walsh approached him again. "The colonel will be arriving in about 15 minutes. He'll enter through the side door and take his place at the front. The ceremony will begin promptly at 1000 hours. David nodded, already planning his shots. He would start with wide angles to capture the scope of the gathering, then move in for close-ups during the speeches and presentation. The key would be staying invisible while documenting everything, letting the story unfold naturally through his lens. He found a position near the side of the hall where he would have a clear view of the proceedings without interfering. As he waited, David reflected on how these military ceremonies always moved him. There was something powerful about witnessing the formal recognition of a life spent in service to others. It reminded him why he had chosen journalism, why telling these stories mattered. The side door opened and Colonel Harrison entered the hall. David raised his camera, ready to begin documenting what he expected would be a moving but routine military retirement ceremony. He had no idea that in less than an hour, he would find himself at the center of the story rather than simply observing it from the sidelines. Colonel James Harrison entered the hall with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades earning the respect of everyone around him. His uniform was pristine, every ribbon and medal positioned exactly where regulations required. Despite being in his 50s, he moved with the confident stride of someone much younger. David immediately began photographing, capturing the moment when the colonel's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, and his face softened with genuine emotion. The hall fell silent as Colonel Harrison made his way to the front. David noticed how every Marine in the room stood a little straighter, their attention focused entirely on their commanding officer. Even the family members seemed to sense the significance of the moment, their conversations stopping as the ceremony's guest of honor took his place. General Morrison struggled to his feet as Colonel Harrison approached, and David quickly positioned himself to capture their reunion. The two men embraced briefly, and David could see the younger man whisper something that made the general smile. It was exactly the kind of human moment that would anchor his story. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the presentation of colors," announced the master of ceremonies, a crisp Marine captain whose voice carried clearly throughout the hall. David moved to get a better angle as the color guard marched in with precise steps. The American flag and Marine Corps colors moved in perfect synchronization, held by Marines whose every movement had been practiced until it became second nature. He captured the moment when Colonel Harrison's hand moved to his heart during the national anthem, his eyes fixed on the flag with an intensity that spoke of countless similar moments throughout his career. As the ceremony progressed, David found himself drawn into the story being told. The speakers painted a picture of a leader who had served in 3 different conflicts, who had earned the Silver Star for gallantry in action, and who had mentored countless young Marines throughout his career. David photographed family members dabbing at their eyes as they heard stories they had never been told, details of their father's and husband's service that he had kept private. The colonel's son stepped to the podium to speak about his father. David focused his lens on the young man's face, capturing the pride and emotion as he described growing up as a Marine's child. "My father taught me that service isn't about the recognition you receive," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion David could see in his features. "It's about the difference you make in the lives of others, often without them ever knowing your name." David glanced at Colonel Harrison, whose jaw was tight with the effort of maintaining his composure. These were the moments that made military retirement ceremonies so powerful, the intersection of public honor and private emotion, the acknowledgement of sacrifices made by entire families. The ceremony continued with the presentation of awards and commendations. Colonel Harrison received several honors, including a Legion of Merit for his final tour of duty. David captured the moment when the medal was pinned to his uniform, focusing on the colonel's hands as they remained steady despite the weight of the moment. As David moved around the periphery of the hall, he noticed something that made him pause. Several of the Marines were looking at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. It wasn't suspicion. He had dealt with that before at military events. This was something different, almost like recognition. He shrugged it off and continued working, assuming they were simply curious about the photographer documenting their colonel's big day. The guest speaker was a retired Marine brigadier general who had served with Colonel Harrison in Iraq. As he spoke about leadership under fire, David found himself remembering his own brief time in the military years ago. He had been much younger then, barely out of high school when he enlisted in the Army. His service had been short, just 4 years, and he rarely thought about it anymore. Photography had become his life's work, and his military experience felt like something from another lifetime. The general was telling a story about a particularly difficult mission when David noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man was describing a joint operation between Marines and Army units, and as the details emerged, David realized he was hearing about an event he remembered very well. Too well. David's hands began to shake slightly as he held his camera. The general was talking about an Army photographer who had volunteered to accompany a dangerous reconnaissance mission, someone who had risked his life to document evidence of war crimes they had discovered. The photographer's images had led to investigations that brought justice to victims and accountability to those responsible. That young soldiers' courage under fire saved lives and upheld the honor of our military, the general continued. His photographs told a story that needed to be told, regardless of the personal cost. David felt the camera becoming heavy in his hands. He looked around the hall and saw that several Marines were now looking directly at him. Corporal Walsh was standing near the back of the room, and when their eyes met, she nodded slightly as if confirming something. Colonel Harrison was listening to the story with intense attention, occasionally glancing toward the back of the hall where David stood. There was something in the colonel's expression that made David's stomach knot with apprehension. The general concluded his remarks and returned to his seat. The master of ceremonies announced that Colonel Harrison would now address the gathering. David raised his camera automatically, his professional instincts taking over despite his growing unease. Colonel Harrison stepped to the podium and looked out over the assembled crowd. His eyes swept across the faces of his family, his fellow Marines, and the various dignitaries who had come to honor his service. Then his gaze settled on David, and for a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the two men looked at each other across the hall. "Before I say goodbye to active duty," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of command, "there's something I need to do. Something that's been weighing on my conscience for 15 years. David's mouth went dry. Around him, the hall had become completely silent, as if everyone sensed that something unexpected was about to happen. He lowered his camera slightly, no longer thinking about his assignment or the photographs he was supposed to be taking. Colonel Harrison stepped away from the podium and began walking toward the back of the hall, his eyes never leaving David's face. David's heart hammered against his chest as Colonel Harrison approached. The hall seemed to shrink around him, and he became acutely aware of every sound. The soft footsteps of the colonel's dress shoes on the polished floor, the rustle of uniforms as Marines turned to follow their commanding officer's unexpected movement, the barely audible whispers of confused family members. 15 years. The number echoed in David's mind. 15 years ago, he had been Specialist David Martinez, 22 years old, and assigned to a combat photography unit in Afghanistan. He had volunteered for that reconnaissance mission because someone needed to document what they had found in that remote village. The images he captured had been horrific, evidence of atrocities committed against civilians by a rogue unit that had been operating without oversight. David remembered the weight of that camera in his hands, so similar to the one he carried now, as he photographed evidence that would eventually lead to court-martials and prison sentences for the perpetrators. He remembered the firefight that had erupted when they were discovered, and the long night they had spent pinned down while waiting for extraction. Most of all, he remembered Colonel Harrison. Not as a colonel then, but as Major Harrison, the Marine officer who had coordinated their rescue. Harrison had been part of the Joint Task Force investigating reports of civilian casualties, and when David's unit came under fire, it was Harrison's Marines who had fought their way through to reach them. Colonel Harrison stopped about 10 feet away from David, close enough that their conversation wouldn't require raised voices, but far enough that the entire hall could witness what was happening. David noticed that his camera was still hanging around his neck, but his hands had fallen to his sides. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since leaving the military. "Specialist Martinez," Colonel Harrison said, using David's old rank for the first time in 15 years. "I believe we have some unfinished business." The use of his military title sent a shock through David's system. Around the hall he could see people looking confused, trying to understand what was happening. But the Marines present, especially the older ones who might have served in Afghanistan, were beginning to put pieces together. "Sir, I don't understand," David managed to say, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly. 15 years ago, you risked your life to do what was right. Your photographs exposed war crimes and saved countless civilian lives. Your actions that day upheld the highest traditions of military service. David felt his face flush. Sir, I was just doing my job. No, Colonel Harrison said firmly. What you did went far beyond your job description. When your unit was compromised and under fire, you could have destroyed those images to protect yourself and your team. Instead, you chose to preserve evidence that you knew was crucial for justice even though it put you in greater danger. The hall was completely silent now. David could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on him, but he couldn't look away from Colonel Harrison's steady gaze. The colonel was speaking not just to him, but to everyone present, ensuring that the entire gathering understood what was happening. I was there that night, Harrison continued. I was the Marine Major who coordinated your extraction. I saw the condition you and your team were in when we reached you. I saw the determination in your eyes when you handed over those memory cards, knowing what they contained and what they would cost the people responsible. David's mouth was completely dry now. He remembered that night with crystal clarity. The relief when the Marines had fought their way through to their position, the exhaustion that had threatened to overwhelm him, and yes, the moment when he had handed over the memory cards to the Marine Major, who had promised they would reach the right people. Sir, David said quietly, I never knew what happened after that night. I was evacuated for medical treatment, and by the time I was cleared for duty, I was being reassigned stateside. Colonel Harrison nodded. Your injuries were more serious than you knew. While you were recovering, those photographs you took became the cornerstone of the largest military justice investigation of that conflict. 17 people were court-martialed based on the evidence you provided. Justice was served because of your courage. Around the hall, David could see understanding dawning on faces. The Marines present were standing a little straighter, their expressions showing respect and recognition. Some of the older veterans in attendance were nodding, their own military experiences helping them understand the significance of what was being revealed. But here's what you don't know, Colonel Harrison continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. After the investigation concluded, I recommended you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The paperwork was submitted, approved at every level, and the medal was authorized. David felt his knees weaken. Sir, I never received any Silver Star. Because by the time it was approved, you had already left the military, Colonel Harrison explained. The Army tried to contact you for the presentation, but you had moved, changed your name slightly for your photography business, and essentially disappeared from their system. The medal has been sitting in a Pentagon office for 14 years. The weight of these words settled over David like a physical force. A Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor, for something he had done so long ago that he barely let himself think about it anymore. Colonel Harrison reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. I've spent the last 5 years tracking you down trying to right this wrong. When I learned that David Martinez, photographer for the Tribune, was the same specialist Martinez who had served so courageously, I knew this day would be perfect for what needs to happen next. David stared at the box in the colonel's hands, understanding beginning to dawn on him. This wasn't a coincidence. His assignment to cover this retirement ceremony hadn't been random. Somehow Colonel Harrison had arranged for him to be here. Colonel Harrison took a deep breath and straightened to his full height. His voice, when he spoke next, carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded Marines in combat zones around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you all to witness something that should have happened 15 years ago. He turned to face the assembled crowd, the small box still in his hands. Hall attention. The command rang out with such force and authority that every person with military experience in the room immediately snapped to attention. Even the civilians seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and rose to their feet. The entire hall stood at attention, 200 people unified in a moment of military precision that transcended rank, service branch, and even civilian status. David found himself automatically straightening his posture, 15 years of civilian life falling away as muscle memory took over. His camera hung forgotten around his neck as he stood perfectly still, waiting for whatever came next. Colonel Harrison's voice filled the silent hall with the formal cadence of military ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present former Army Specialist David Martinez, who served his country with extraordinary valor during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. David felt his eyes begin to burn with unshed tears. He had not been called by his military rank in so many years that hearing it spoken aloud felt like awakening from a long dream. Around him he could sense rather than see the gathering's attention focused entirely on this unexpected moment. On March 15, 2009, Colonel Harrison continued. Specialist Martinez volunteered for a high-risk reconnaissance mission to investigate reports of civilian casualties in a remote Afghan village. What his team discovered was evidence of war crimes being committed by a rogue military unit operating without authorization or oversight. General Morrison, still standing at attention despite his age and walking cane, watched with the intensity of someone who understood exactly what kind of courage was being described. The other veterans in the hall, both active duty and retired, maintained perfect military bearing while absorbing every word. When hostile forces discovered the reconnaissance team's position, Specialist Martinez and his unit came under sustained enemy fire for over 6 hours. During this engagement, Specialist Martinez had multiple opportunities to destroy the photographic evidence he had gathered, evidence that could have been used against him and his team if they were captured. David remembered that night with vivid clarity now. The decision to preserve those photographs had seemed obvious at the time, but listening to Colonel Harrison describe it in formal, military language made him realize how significant others had judged his choice to be. Instead of seeking the safety that destroying the evidence would have provided, Harrison continued, Specialist Martinez chose to preserve documentation that he knew was crucial for bringing justice to innocent victims. His decision placed him and his team at greater risk, but ensured that war crimes would not go unpunished. Colonel Harrison opened the wooden box in his hands, revealing a star-shaped medal suspended from a ribbon of red, white, and blue. Even from several feet away, David could see the distinctive design of the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor in combat. The photographs taken by Specialist Martinez became the cornerstone evidence in the largest military justice investigation of that conflict. 17 individuals were court-martialed and convicted based on his documentation. His courage under fire saved countless civilian lives and upheld the honor of the United States military. The colonel stepped closer to David, the medal now clearly visible to everyone in the hall. David noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, though whether from emotion or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. Specialist Martinez, Colonel Harrison said, his voice carrying both formality and genuine warmth, by order of the Secretary of the Army and the authority vested in me by the President of the United States, it is my honor to present you with the Silver Star for gallantry in action. David felt his breath catch in his throat. This was really happening. After 15 years, after building an entirely new life as a civilian photographer, his military service was being recognized in a way he had never imagined possible. Colonel Harrison stepped forward and pinned the Silver Star to David's shirt just above his left breast pocket. The weight of the medal was surprisingly substantial, and David felt it settle against his chest like a physical reminder of choices made long ago. The citation reads, Harrison continued, his voice formal but filled with respect, for gallantry in action while engaged in military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force. Specialist Martinez distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous conduct while serving as a combat photographer with the 55th Signal Company during combat operations in Afghanistan. His decisive actions under enemy fire and unwavering commitment to justice reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The hall remained at attention, but David could see tears on many faces. Corporal Walsh, still standing near the back of the room, had tears streaming down her cheeks. Several of the Marines were visibly emotional, their understanding of military valor making them fully appreciate what they were witnessing. Colonel Harrison stepped back and rendered a perfect military salute. David's body responded automatically, his own hand snapping up in a salute that felt as natural as breathing despite the years that had passed. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two men held their salutes, acknowledging not just this moment but the shared experiences that had led them here. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Harrison announced, I present to you Silver Star recipient David Martinez. The hall erupted in applause that seemed to shake the building's foundation. David felt overwhelmed by the sound, by the standing ovation that continued for what felt like an eternity. Through his blurred vision, he could see the genuine emotion on the faces around him: pride, respect, and recognition from people who understood the cost of military service. General Morrison made his way forward, moving slowly but with obvious determination. When he reached David, the elderly officer extended his hand. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "it's an honor to meet you. What you did that day embodies everything we hope our service members will be." David shook the general's hand, still struggling to find words. "Thank you, sir. I never expected. I never knew anyone even remembered." "The military never forgets true valor," General Morrison replied. "Sometimes it just takes us a while to catch up with our own paperwork." One by one, the Marines in the hall approached David. Each handshake, each expression of respect, added another layer to his understanding of what this moment meant. These were not just polite congratulations. They were acknowledgments from one warrior to another, recognition that transcended time and service branch. Colonel Harrison's son approached with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Martinez," he said, "thank you for your service, and thank you for showing us what real courage looks like." David finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse with emotion. "Thank you, all of you. I never thought. I spent so many years just trying to forget that night, and now you know that your service mattered," Colonel Harrison said quietly. "Now you know that you made a difference that lasted far beyond that single night in Afghanistan." The applause was finally dying down, but the energy in the hall remained electric. David realized that his camera was still hanging around his neck, and for the first time in his professional career, he had completely forgotten to document the most important story he had ever been part of. As the crowd began to settle back into their seats, Colonel Harrison gently guided David to a chair that had been placed at the front of the hall. The ceremony was clearly far from over, and David found himself in the surreal position of being an honored guest at an event he had come to photograph as a working journalist. "I imagine you have questions," Colonel Harrison said quietly, taking a seat beside him while the master of ceremonies worked to restore order to the proceedings. David touched the silver star pinned to his shirt, still struggling to believe it was real. "Sir, how did you even find me? How did you know I was the same person?" Colonel Harrison smiled, the formal ceremony mask dropping away to reveal genuine warmth. "It took me 5 years and a lot of help from people who are very good at finding missing pieces of military history. The breakthrough came when one of my staff officers was reading your newspaper's coverage of Veterans Day last year. Your byline caught his attention: David Martinez, former Army photographer. David remembered that assignment clearly. He had covered a ceremony at the local VA hospital, and his editor had included a brief biographical note mentioning his military background. At the time, it had seemed like a minor detail. "My officer did some digging and found your old service record," Harrison continued. "When we confirmed you were the same Specialist Martinez from that night in Afghanistan, I knew I had to make this right. I've been carrying the weight of that incomplete recognition for 15 years. The colonel paused as Corporal Walsh approached with a folder. "Sir, the additional documentation you requested." Harrison took the folder and handed it to David. "This contains copies of all the paperwork related to your Silver Star recommendation, including letters from the commanders whose units were affected by your photographs. I thought you might want to see the impact your actions had." David opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a formal citation signed by a general he didn't recognize. But as he read through the pages, he began to see the full scope of what had resulted from that night in Afghanistan. There were reports detailing the investigation that followed, lists of the 17 service members who had been court-martialed, and most importantly, accounts of the civilian lives that had been saved when the rogue unit was disbanded. One document particularly caught his attention: a letter from a village elder thanking the American military for bringing justice to his community. "The village you photographed," Colonel Harrison explained, noticing David's focus on that particular letter, "is now home to a school and medical clinic built with compensation funds from the military justice proceedings. 43 children attend that school today because you chose to preserve evidence rather than destroy it." David felt fresh tears threatening. He had spent 15 years believing that night had been nothing more than a traumatic experience to be forgotten. Learning that it had led to tangible improvements in people's lives gave his memories an entirely new context. "Sir, why did you arrange for this to happen at your retirement ceremony? This should be your day." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment, looking out over the hall where people were engaged in animated conversations about what they had just witnessed. "David, may I call you David?" "Of course, sir. David, this is exactly what I wanted my retirement ceremony to be about. In 32 years of service, I've learned that the military's greatest strength isn't our weapons or our tactics. It's our people. Specifically, it's people like you who choose to do what's right even when it's difficult or dangerous." The colonel stood and walked to the window, his dress uniform crisp against the morning light. "When I took command of my first unit 28 years ago, I made myself a promise. I swore that I would never let good soldiers go unrecognized, never let acts of valor disappear into bureaucratic shuffles, never let the system forget the people who make sacrifices for others." He turned back to David. "Finding you and making sure you received proper recognition became my personal mission. When I learned I was being assigned to Camp Pendleton for my final tour, and that you were working for a newspaper in this area, I knew it was meant to be." David shook his head in amazement. "You arranged for me to be assigned to cover your ceremony. I may have suggested to your editor that the Tribune would want their best photographer for such an important event," Harrison admitted with a slight smile. "And I may have mentioned that you had a military background that would help you understand the significance of the ceremony." The pieces were falling into place now. David realized that nothing about today had been coincidental. From his assignment to cover the event, to the level of access he had been given, to the way several Marines had seemed to recognize him, it had all been carefully orchestrated. "Sir, what about the other people who were with me that night? My team leader, Sergeant Williams, and our translator, Ahmad?" Colonel Harrison's expression grew more serious. "Sergeant Williams received a Bronze Star for his actions that night. He stayed in the Army, made it to Sergeant Major, and retired last year. He's actually here today. He flew in from North Carolina specifically to see this moment." David's head snapped up, scanning the crowd. Colonel Harrison pointed to a man in civilian clothes sitting in the third row, a man David now recognized despite the gray hair and 20 pounds he had gained. "Sergeant Major Williams specifically requested to be here when you received your recognition," Harrison continued. "He said he never forgot the courage you showed that night, and he wanted to see you properly honored." David felt his emotions threatening to overwhelm him again. Sergeant Williams had been his team leader, the non-commissioned officer who had kept them all alive that night. Knowing that his old sergeant had traveled across the country to witness this moment added another layer of meaning to the day. As for Ahmad, Harrison continued more quietly. He continued working as a translator for 2 more years after that incident. The information he provided was crucial to the investigation. The military helped him and his family immigrate to the United States in 2011. He's now a citizen and works as a translator for the State Department. David closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the information. All these years he had wondered what had happened to the people who had shared that dangerous night with him. Learning that they had not only survived but thrived gave him a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. "David," Colonel Harrison said gently, "that night in Afghanistan wasn't just about the photographs you took. It was about a group of people who chose to do what was right despite the risk. Today isn't just about recognizing your courage. It's about acknowledging that your service mattered, that your choices had consequences that lasted far beyond that single night." David looked down at the silver star pinned to his shirt, then back up at the colonel who had spent 5 years tracking him down to right a 15-year-old wrong. For the first time since leaving the military, he truly understood that his service had been part of something larger than himself. The master of ceremonies approached the front of the hall, clearly struggling to regain control of an event that had taken an unexpected but meaningful turn. Colonel Harrison stood and gestured for David to remain seated as the ceremony prepared to continue. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "while this morning has given us an unexpected honor to witness, we are here primarily to celebrate the retirement of Colonel James Harrison. If I may direct your attention to the front, we will continue with the presentation of Colonel Harrison's retirement awards." But before the ceremony could proceed, a voice called out from the audience, "Request permission to approach, sir." David turned to see Sergeant Major Williams standing in his row. his civilian clothes unable to disguise the military bearing that remained as sharp as ever. Colonel Harrison smiled and nodded his permission. Williams made his way to the front of the hall with the purposeful stride David remembered so well. When he reached David, the older man stopped and extended his hand. "Specialist Martinez," Williams said, using David's old rank with obvious pride. "It's about time, soldier." David stood and shook his former team leader's hand, but Williams pulled him into a brief, fierce hug that spoke of shared experiences and mutual respect. "Sergeant Major," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you're here." "Wouldn't have missed it for the world," Williams replied. "I've been waiting 15 years to see you get the recognition you deserved." When Colonel Harrison tracked me down and told me what he was planning, I cleared my calendar immediately. Williams stepped back but kept his hands on David's shoulders. "Son, what you did that night saved lives. Not just the civilians in that village, but American lives too. That rogue unit was making enemies for all of us with their actions. Your photographs put a stop to something that could have gotten a lot of good soldiers killed." David felt the weight of words he had needed to hear for 15 years. In all his civilian life, no one had been able to understand the complexity of that night in Afghanistan, the impossible choices and the long-term consequences that he could only guess at. "I need you to know something," Williams continued. "After you were evacuated, I made sure those memory cards got to the right people. I personally delivered them to Major Harrison here, and I watched him promise me that justice would be done." He kept that promise. Colonel Harrison stepped forward. Sergeant Major Williams was instrumental in the investigation that followed. His testimony helped ensure that the evidence was properly authenticated and admissible in the court-martial proceedings. Williams turned to address the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I served 28 years in the United States Army. I led soldiers in combat in 3 different countries. And I can tell you without hesitation that I never saw a braver act than what this young man did that night." The hall erupted in another round of applause, and David found himself overwhelmed once again by the recognition. But Williams raised his hand for quiet. "There's something else," Williams said. "Something I've been carrying for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to share it." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small wrapped package. "This is from Ahmad, our translator that night. When Colonel Harrison contacted me about today, I reached out to Ahmad as well. He couldn't make the trip from Washington, D.C., but he wanted you to have this." David unwrapped the package with trembling hands. Inside was a small carved wooden figure, a traditional Afghan peace symbol, along with a handwritten letter. Williams nodded toward the letter. "Go ahead, read it out loud." Ahmad specifically asked that everyone hear his words. David unfolded the letter, his hands shaking slightly as he began to read. "Dear David, I have thought of you many times over the years since that dangerous night. Your courage to preserve the truth, even when it put us all at greater risk, showed me what American soldiers really stand for. Because of your photographs, justice came to our village. The bad men were punished, and our people learned that not all soldiers are the same. You helped my family trust the American military enough to accept their help in coming to this country. My children are now American citizens because of the chain of events that started with your bravery. I pray that Allah blesses you and your family. Your friend always, Ahmad Razak." The hall was completely silent as David finished reading. He looked up to see tears on many faces, including Colonel Harrison's wife, who was sitting in the front row. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat gently.
"David, would you do us the honor of remaining here for the rest of the ceremony?"
"I think it's fitting that my retirement celebration include recognition of the kind of service member that makes me proud to have worn this uniform." David nodded, unable to trust his voice to respond. As he took his seat again, he noticed that several news photographers had arrived and were discreetly documenting the proceedings. Word of what had happened was apparently spreading beyond the hall. The ceremony continued with Colonel Harrison's retirement presentation, but the context had changed completely. Every speech about service and sacrifice now carried additional weight. Every reference to honor and duty resonated with deeper meaning because of what the audience had just witnessed. When Colonel Harrison finally stepped to the podium to deliver his retirement remarks, he looked directly at David before beginning to speak. 32 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath included a promise to support and defend not just our nation's laws but our values, justice, integrity, and respect for human dignity. Harrison's voice carried clearly through the hall as he continued. Today I'm reminded that honoring that oath sometimes requires us to go beyond our assigned duties, to risk our own safety for the greater good, and to ensure that the truth is preserved even when it's difficult or dangerous. He gestured toward David. The young soldier we honored today embodies everything I hope to achieve in my 3 decades of service. His actions remind us that individual choices matter, that courage in the face of adversity defines character, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the determination to do what is right. Colonel Harrison's retirement speech became a meditation on service and sacrifice, on the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, and on the lasting impact that individual acts of courage can have on the world. David found himself understanding his own military experience in an entirely new way, seeing it not as a brief chapter he had left behind, but as a foundation that had shaped everything that came after. As the ceremony drew toward its close, David realized that he had received far more than a medal today. He had been given back a part of himself that he had thought was lost forever. As the formal retirement ceremony concluded, David found himself surrounded by people eager to shake his hand and share their thoughts about what they had witnessed. The hall buzzed with conversation as attendees lingered, clearly reluctant to let such a meaningful day come to an end. Colonel Harrison's wife, a gracious woman named Sarah, approached David with tears still visible in her eyes. "Mr. Martinez, thank you for allowing us to share in this moment. James has been planning this for 2 years, ever since he first learned he might be able to find you. It means everything to him to be able to right this wrong." David shook her hand warmly. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband has given me something I never expected to receive. This recognition means more to me than I can express." Sarah smiled and glanced toward her husband, who was engaged in animated conversation with General Morrison and several other officers. "He's been carrying the weight of incomplete recognition for 15 years. Today I can see that burden lifted from his shoulders. You've given him something too. The satisfaction of knowing he kept his promise to never let good soldiers go unrecognized." As the crowd began to thin, Corporal Walsh approached David with a professional camera in her hands. "Sir, I know you're a photographer, but would you mind if we took some official photographs for the Marine Corps archives? This moment should be properly documented." David almost laughed at the irony. He had come here to document someone else's story, and had instead become the subject of the most important photograph of his life. "Of course, Corporal. I understand the importance of preserving these moments." The photo session was brief but meaningful. Pictures of David with his silver star, with Colonel Harrison, with Sergeant Major Williams, and with General Morrison. Each image captured a piece of a story that had taken 15 years to complete. As the official photography concluded, David retrieved his own camera and looked at it with new understanding. For 15 years he had used photography to tell other people's stories, to document moments of significance in their lives. He had never realized that his own story was still being written, that the most important chapter was yet to come. Colonel Harrison approached as David was packing his equipment. "David, there's one more thing I need to tell you. The Pentagon wants to arrange a formal ceremony in Washington, D.C., to officially recognize your Silver Star. They're inviting Ahmad to attend, and several of the civilian lives that were saved because of your actions will be there as well." David paused in his packing. "The people from the village?" "A delegation of village elders, including the man who wrote that letter in your folder. They want to thank you personally for bringing justice to their community. The State Department is arranging their travel." The thought of meeting the people whose lives had been affected by that night in Afghanistan was overwhelming. David had spent 15 years wondering about the consequences of his actions, and now he would have the opportunity to see those consequences firsthand. "Sir, I don't know what to say. This has all been so much more than I ever imagined." Colonel Harrison placed a hand on David's shoulder. "David, what happened today isn't the end of your story, it's a new beginning. You've spent 15 years building a career as a photographer, documenting other people's service and sacrifice. Now you have the opportunity to help others understand what military service really means, to bridge the gap between civilian and military communities." As they walked toward the exit, David reflected on the transformation that had occurred in just a few hours. He had entered this hall as a working photographer covering a routine military retirement. He was leaving as a recognized veteran, reconnected with his military service and carrying a renewed sense of purpose. Sergeant Major Williams was waiting by the exit with several other veterans who had attended the ceremony. "Martinez," he called out, "we're heading to lunch at a place near the base. You're coming with us." It wasn't a request, and David found himself smiling at the familiar tone of command. "Yes, Sergeant Major." As they walked across the parade ground, David noticed that several young Marines stopped to look at the silver star pinned to his shirt. Word of what had happened in the retirement ceremony was clearly spreading across the base. One young Marine, barely out of his teens, approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, sir. Are you the photographer who got the silver star today?" David paused, still adjusting to his new reality. "Yes, I am." The Marine straightened to attention. "Sir, my squad leader told me what you did." "Thank you for your service, and thank you for showing us what courage looks like." David returned the young Marine's salute, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with recognition. These young service members would hear his story, and it would become part of their understanding of what it meant to serve. Over lunch, David listened as the veterans shared their own stories of service and sacrifice. For the first time in 15 years, he contributed his own experiences to the conversation, no longer treating his military service as a closed chapter, but as a foundational part of who he was. As the afternoon wore on and the group began to disperse, David realized that his relationship with his military service had been fundamentally changed. The shame and trauma he had carried for so long had been replaced by pride and understanding. The nightmares from Afghanistan that had haunted him for years seemed less frightening now that he understood their larger context. Driving home that evening, David thought about the story he would write about Colonel Harrison's retirement ceremony. It would be unlike any assignment he had ever covered. A first-person account of unexpected recognition and the power of military brotherhood that transcends time and circumstance. The silver star rode on his chest as he drove, a tangible reminder that service continues long after the uniform is hung up, that the choices made in moments of crisis can echo through decades, and that sometimes the most important recognition comes not when it's expected, but when it's needed most. David Martinez had entered that hall as a photographer documenting someone else's story. He left as a Silver Star recipient whose own story of service and sacrifice would inspire others for years to come. The young soldier who had risked everything to preserve the truth had finally been welcomed home. As he pulled into his driveway, David realized that tomorrow he would begin writing not just about Colonel Harrison's retirement, but about the day a routine assignment became a life-changing recognition of service and valor. It would be the most important story of his career, and for the first time, he would be both the photographer and the subject, both the observer and the observed. The camera that had once been simply a tool of his trade had become something more, a bridge between his past and his future, a reminder that some stories take decades to fully develop, and that the most meaningful photographs are often the ones that capture moments when lives are fundamentally changed. David Martinez, Silver Star recipient, was finally ready to tell his complete story.